Welcome to the Anthropology in Business podcast, where you'll learn about the many ways anthropology is applied in business and why business anthropology is one of the most effective lenses for making sense of organizations and consumers. Through conversations with leading anthropologists working in advertising, marketing, consumer behavior, organizational culture, user experience, and many other roles, you'll learn firsthand what it means to do business anthropology and how the work differs from academic anthropology. We'll discuss issues like the pace and depth of research in business, our visibility and influence as practitioners, and what we can do to build our brand. We will also focus on the value and impact of our research in business so that we can help business leaders understand why they should be hiring anthropologists. I'm your host, Matt Artz, a business anthropologist specializing in design anthropology and working at the intersection of product management, user experience, and business strategy. Let's get started. Hi, everyone. Welcome back. I'm Matt Artz of Anthro in Business. I'm here today with Lora Koycheva. Lora is a visiting researcher at the Ludwig-Maximilians-Universität in Munich, previously a senior research associate at the Technical University of Munich, and you also are quite busy outside of the academic world, a convener of EASA, previously at a lot of applied experience over the last 15 years, a coach at Think, Make It Start. You're on the EPIC content steering committee and a little bit involved with the Why the World Needs Anthropologists. So we'll talk about that. And also, I believe, said co-founding a startup. So it would be good to maybe talk about a little bit of the application of anthropology to sort of entrepreneurship endeavors. So thanks for joining me today. Would you begin by telling everybody how you came into anthropology?
Thank you for inviting me, Matt. I was really excited to get your invitation because I love your podcast, and there's been some fantastic colleagues with amazing stories that have been featured. So how did I come to Anthro? It's a bit of a long story. Perhaps the very quick summary is that for biographical reasons, and also professionally. Biographically, I think I was an anthropologist all my life. And professionally, because I've been a misfit, first because of the biographical reasons, but also I think as time went on, I really found a lot of value in being the misfit. And perhaps I can expand a little bit on that. But so I'm going to date myself, but my childhood was behind the Iron Curtain. So I was born in Bulgaria, and my childhood was in Sofia. And so I think through that, I kind of from very early on developed this kind of sensibility and knowledge about other worlds, right? So this kind of knowing there's something else beyond the border. I was heavily policed back then, and wondering what kind of world that is, and seeing the Western as the other. It was almost this kind of forbidden world, right? That I think growing up as a child, you kind of have a fascination with, like, wow, what does that mean, right? And then also because I think at the time, the Soviet way of instilling internationalism in children and kind of promoting that ideology was through offering a lot of children's books were often folk tales from other people's, right? Other people's folk tales. So growing up, I was reading a lot of Baltic people's folk tales and whatnot. So it was just kind of this, as it happened, right, by force of circumstance, it was, I was always growing up aware there's other worlds out there somewhere, and I'm very curious about how they are similar or different or whatnot. Right, so that's one thing. Although I should say, right, more than half my life now, I've been not. I've been a nomad for most of my life. But I think I do have to credit that that formative years, I guess, about being curious about other ways of living. Let's put it this way. And then, personally, I think, I'm easily bored. I like multitudes. And so I think this kind of professionally translated in my path to anthropology. Of course, nobody, wakes up one day and says, oh, I want to be an anthropologist. But growing up, I didn't know what I wanted to be. I wanted to be, first a journalist. I founded the first school newspaper when I was 8 or 7 or something like that, I think. And then I wanted to be in theater for a really long time, which kind of translated in being going for creative writing and broadcast media in my undergrad. But then I got really bored because I was on the production side. I was never in front of camera. So I got really bored with having to push the same button at the same exact second of every day. That was just not for me. And so at Columbia College Chicago, where I got my bachelor's in cultural studies, they kind of had this curriculum where they were really foregrounding the almost vocational and hands-on aspect of doing something, but also they had a blended curriculum with you have to take classes in anthropology and philosophy and history. And so this is how I got cultural studies bachelor there. And at the end of my BA, again, I had the problem of misfitting and wanting too many things at the same time. I didn't know if I want to be a human rights lawyer. I didn't know if I want to be in arts management. I somehow thought I should go in psychology, and I'm so glad this never happened, because I would have been a terrible psychologist, and that would have never worked for many reasons. But I had a fantastic mentors at Columbia College, Andrew Causey and John Erdman, who are both anthropologists and who kind of really steered me towards, listen, you really should be an anthropologist. So I was tapped a little bit, but I think I'm forever grateful to them, because I think that was the right kind of push that I needed at the time. And then I was accepted. I accepted a spot at Northwestern, which was fantastic, because there you're required to think and act in multiples, because it's one of the few 4-field anthropology programs in the US. So you are trained in all 4 fields: biological, archaeology, linguistic, and social anthropology. So that was really appealed to my inability to say yes to just and pursue just one thing. But also there, I think I was a little bit of a misfit again, because I was an Eastern Europeanist in a largely Africanist department. I mean, Northwestern is the premier Africanist school. I think in the US, it's fair to say. And also I was not coming, as unlike most of my colleagues, was not coming from anthropology, right? Most of them just had bachelors in anthropology, and I didn't. I had this hodgepodge kind of background. And so I think through that, it's interesting, because I think that experience was very formative in informing how I currently approach somehow this conversation about translating anthropology, and how anthropology can appear a bit standoffish to an outsider, right? With the really heavy-duty jargon that sometimes we adopt. But I'm also a very staunch believer, I think, and defender, it's fair to say, of anthropology against charges that it's too elitist. And perhaps we can go back to that later on. But to speed the story up along a little bit, I graduated in 2012. It was a terrible year to graduate, because there were just no jobs, period, right? I mean, we very often hear there's no jobs. I talk to people who graduated in 2003, and they say, well, there were no jobs. And then colleagues now are saying, oh, but there's no jobs. In 2012, 2 years after the bubble and all the mayhem that happened, there really, really were no jobs. Luckily, I got a postdoc, but then after that, I had to quit all professional endeavors whatsoever because of having to take care of a very frail and ill family member. So I was kind of also experienced this a bit of a kiss of death of, massive gap on your CV. Mm-hmm. There's nothing, you just disappear. And then, but that wasn't the end of it, right? I was always, I think through all of those experiences, I was always very much looking at the world and everything that was happening around as an anthropologist, but still looking for ways to promote anthropology and to do something with it, with other disciplines. And this is how I ended up at the Technical University of Munich in the management department, the Center for Entrepreneurship Research that you just mentioned. And there I did both research on questions of how academics can be encouraged to become more entrepreneurial and to start their own ventures. And moonshot venturing. But also I was in a more applied vein coaching. And this is where I was bringing a lot of anthropological kind of thinking and methods to a makeathon. Think, Make, Start is a makeathon to engineering and business students trying to create their own ventures from scratch. So, and then more recently, I'm currently working on a project on innovation and sustainability and speculative anthropological methods. That's the work that I'm doing at the LMU. Mm-hmm. And I'm in the process of co-founding initiative on, the vision is preparing society to live with and eventually as robots. So
yeah, great. Well,
fairly meandering path through a lot of things, but I think that probably resonates with people.
Yeah, with most listeners from those that reach out. So thanks for sharing all that. So there's a lot of things in there to dive into. To go all the way back, you use the term misfit. Mm-hmm. Do you use it in the sense of like literally not fitting into various situations, or being like oftentimes in the States, we use it in the sense of like maybe not derogatory, but maybe somewhat negative, where like you're kind of bad, and so is it just not fitting into the context, or is it actually like, being bad or difficult or kind of going against the norm?
It's a great question. I think I am aware of this negative connotation. I am trying to take it back for many reasons, because I think a lot of anthropology is contrarian in its approach, right? I think a lot of us have this feeling of saying yes, but, right? Or, but what if? So, poke a little bit at the status quo. And I think that, and also, if I think about how do we present ourselves and how do we translate our value to businesses, especially, a lot of effort has been recently kind of focused on conversations about how anthropology informs strategy. And we see a lot of anthropologists working in strategy and foresight, and I think that's fantastic. But I also think there's a substrata that we're not paying enough attention to and that we're not kind of owning enough, is that anthropology can also be quite tactical. Mm-hmm. And it can be, the method is very creative and improvisational. I think that we're very good at capturing the unexpected and rolling along with it, right? I think this is what makes us really good specialists, for lack of a better word, at, dealing with uncertainty and with curveballs. And I think this is one of the things that really make anthropology valuable to businesses, whether it's corporations, right? Or whether it's even startups. that are operating under conditions of very pervasive uncertainty. And so I think the misfit is partly tongue-in-cheek because, in order to be an anthropologist, I think that, and colleagues may disagree with this, or it can be a kind of a polemical point, but I think we have to constantly disembed ourselves, right? I mean, we do operate into these spaces of discomfort, right? That where we have to see the world anew, to make the familiar strange, right? So this is a kind of a process of disembedding and in many ways purposeful misfitting, right? So it's a question of operationalizing that, but also a question of how do we translate that process. It has been a bit of a risk taking on my part to say I'm a misfit, and this is actually exactly what you need. But I think it also I think, okay, to be fair, perhaps because my experience is mostly dealing with startups and the innovation sphere, and that kind of language, I think, has currency. I'm not entirely sure if this language is the absolute best if you are talking to somebody at C-suite level. I don't know. I'd be curious to hear from colleagues on that topic. But I think sometimes our value is that there's a devil in every detail of every business, and that devil is tactical, and you need a appropriately tactical misfitter to make sense of it, right? A bit of taking away the negativity and a bit of tongue-in-cheek. And
got it.
I think it's something that every person should present themselves as they are comfortable, and I'm comfortable with that. So
no, it's great, and I can appreciate it, and in many ways, have been highly contrarian in lots of aspects of life. But coming from a business background, because I studied business and technology early on and went into anthropology, I can see how the critique of anthropologists being kind of contrarian or too difficult in like certain settings is real and valid. And, to see one word turn into like, a 40-minute sort of diatribe about like the meaning of something can be highly disruptive to maybe valuable and maybe the right thing to do in some argument, right? But it can also be sort of highly disruptive to like the productivity of, say, maybe a meeting in some sense. And so obviously there's pros and cons to that perspective and to acting that way. And maybe it's about, finding the right time to do it. We could maybe make the argument in a professional context, but, and I'm sure there'll be people listening who completely disagree with that statement, but, that's how I feel, sort of straddling the business tech world and anthropology. And so for people who, for people in maybe the business world who think that sometimes we are too difficult, how do you sort of go about doing it effectively? Right? How can you sort of be contrarian and challenge them in a productive, sort of effective, maybe you could even argue efficient way, without possibly bogging down the process to where, if you're working with startups, you never create anything? So I think there's a nuance between being traditionally critical, right? Like the kind of critique, what you just said, go on a diatribe or, really go off the deep end, critiquing a concept or never really making that switch from critique to prescription, right? Or just staying within the critical phase. And so that's the one thing. That's not what I'm advocating for in saying that you're being difficult. But I think that business, and sometimes I've experienced this with sparring with CEOs, for example, although admittedly I don't have as much experience as perhaps some of the colleagues listening in on the show, or but like people appreciate this fresh perspective
that comes from uniquely anthropologically critical view on the world. And I think that's one of the values that we could bring, right? As long as you said, it's not a question of just never answering the and so what, now this kind of complementary aspect of that critique that necessarily, I think, must come, right? Yeah. So what if we critique capital, right? What if we are critical of that conversation? We need to be able to make and build into our practice as applied anthropologists in business, this switch on using the critique to provide value for businesses. And that is, I think, through also being able to really adopt the consulting mindset, right? When you're saying, okay, and now this. Yeah. Now this is what you have to do for this and that reason.
Okay. So when you shared your story, you kind of jumped from the PhD, classic, for field, obviously not very applied, to to doing some applied work. I mean, I know you had the gap year, but to coaching. So what? Where in there was your sort of transformative experience that helped you start thinking in this more consultative or entrepreneurial way? And maybe it happened earlier, but like, at what point did you sort of switch out of the mode of like, probably what I assume you were learning in that kind of academic program to, really the way you're thinking and talking today?
Yeah. So I think, my dissertation was on the question of acting under uncertainty. Right. So my question was, how do people live their lives when they don't know what's happening around them in questions of pervasive socio-political change that makes everyday life uncertain, right? How do you make decisions about, because I was working with women, so it was a question about how do you make decisions about, childcare, when do you start a family, how do you construct your career, et cetera, et cetera. So, that lent itself topically, I think, very readily to questions that innovation and entrepreneurship are fundamentally very interested in, because, one might argue that entrepreneurship is acting under uncertainty and discovering the new market product opportunities under uncertainty and dealing and overcoming that uncertainty, right? So I think topically, I think already the interest that I had during my academic career and my education lend themselves productively to making that switch. But more, I don't know what to call it, dispositionally perhaps. I think I was always very curious about what more can anthropology do in the world and for the world, right? I mean, one of the frustrations that I've always had with the traditional way in which academia still operates is that there's a lot of potential there that just does not translate to, and it's an overused word, but impact, right? So it can be an impactful endeavor, but it never is. So I'll admit I was not very patient with the peer review process. I knew, so what if I can critique the system that produces the insecurities in my interlocutors' lives? And, what if I can really know how to help them, but nobody listens, right? So I was always looking for a way that I can take this anthropological skill set and commitment to people, and to people-centered any and everything, and to really find a context in which this creates impact and a lot more ripple. And that is far more immediate than, the usual, we give voice to our interlocutors, and it's in an article that's behind the paywall that's published 4 or 5 years after, after the research was done, and, who gets to read it, right? I mean, I'm I'm making a bit of a caricature out of that process, but we all know, I think, especially those of us who have left academia and have had that struggle will recognize that impatience with the so what, right, of this very elaborate, otherwise process. So innovation and entrepreneurship was this for me. I thought, okay, this is a context where I can really see how, so coaching can really help engineers and entrepreneurs create better businesses in the end of the day, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And so now I know you called out the need to be tactical, but I actually want to go back to strategy for a second because, strategy is one of those words. I just said this in an email to somebody the other day, but it's one of those words that's even like rarely agreed upon in business like literature, sure. Even less so outside of that. And it is, I oftentimes see people sort of just referring to it in like casual ways, like, it's sort of a trade-off or the decision we make. And, I don't really see it like as necessarily being used in a way that's constructing, sustainable kind of competitive advantage or laying out sort of like long-term intent, where you're going to go up against, entrenched players and you're going to find a way to do so, over a very long period of time, like, Honda did when it started with like lawnmower engines or whatever. I forget what it started with, but weed whackers or lawnmowers, like, and having that 20, 30 year vision. It's often, it seems, while there might be some quote unquote strategies that come out of the work we do and are highly successful, it still doesn't seem to me to be generally, the term in art when it's used by anthropologists just seems a little light on maybe the long-term vision of that. So how do you look at strategy, in the entrepreneur space? How would you define it?
Oof, that's a tough one. I'm not sure. I don't know. I really will have to think longer than the space and time I have in a
sure.
in a conversation like that. But does it need to be a single way of defining strategy? I know exactly what you're saying, that there's disagreement on what it is. In the entrepreneurship context, I would say there's a lot of interest around storytelling, right? I think a lot of colleagues are going to say, strategy is the story that is being built up around the venture. And that's the strategic narrative. And the strategic narrative also ripples into the whole structuring of the culture of a particular venture or an organization, right? So I think that's one way of setting up what strategy is and how it can benefit from anthropology. What is the general myth around the venture, right? Whether it's a small venture or a big venture that is being built. How does that myth operate internally and externally? But also, and this is again where I have to say, we really ought to think about the difficult interaction between strategy and tactics, right? Because the way that strategy is enacted is going to have perhaps some tactical component. Whether you're talking about different departments within a large corporate and how, they're taking up the vision differently, and why is that not, how is that affecting the performance, right, of a particular corporate, I think, or venture. I think, I think that's kind of the immediate answer that I have for you. I'm not sure if this answers your questions too much, but
Yeah. So no, thanks.
I'm curious to know why you're bothered by the strategy talk. Now you have to tell me.
No, I guess I think it is used in a way that is maybe not. I mean, I appreciate there's different models in the business world, from, Porter's forces to like what I was alluding to with strategic intent. And, there's, there is no shortage of ways of looking at strategy. But I oftentimes I feel the word is overused, that it's not necessarily, that a decision alone is not being strategic necessarily. Right. Just the fact that you make a decision does not necessarily mean you're being strategic, or at least effectively strategic.
Sure.
And so, it just seems to me that there is an opportunity for us to better define how we contribute to strategy. But to do that, we, to some degree, have to at least define what strategy is. What is it that we're contributing to? And that's obviously a project for offline of this podcast, but it keeps percolating up. But I want to know, okay, but what is it that you're actually doing? Like, it's not just, here's my insights, I think you should do this, right? It's more than that to me. And so anyway, maybe that's for some future conversation somewhere. But moving, given the podcast format, to move beyond that, just for the sake of time, this work that you're doing in entrepreneurship it's also interesting because, you're an anthropologist teaching not in an anthropology department like myself, like, some colleagues here that that actually quite a number of us in the business anthropology department just don't teach in anthropology departments. Business is very common, right? And so that's an opportunity for us to bring our ideas to somebody else, but there's also a challenge in that. And so, seeing as you're in that world, do you want to speak to how you're approaching that?
How do I teach anthropology to non-anthropologists, to engineers and management students? Well, currently I no longer do. That was the role in my last position. Currently it's just a research position. But I actually enjoy that process a lot. It is challenging, as we all know, because it's not part of a curriculum, right? It's not part of where you have to really synthesize a lot of a fairly complex discipline with a lot of different subparts, right? Into what is usually just a workshop, or sometimes even if it's a semester-long course, it's still quite a lot. In my practice, 2 courses that I created, I don't know if that's of interest to your audience, but so one of the courses was called Cultural Analysis, and basically it was teaching cultural code, right? Seeing culture as a system of codes that can impact both mature organizations and how they operate and what happens in terms of performance, right? I mean, because this is what the business world is interested in, performance, right? How do we enhance it? How do we maintain it? And how culture impacts that. But also a question of how do you understand the cultural context which offer you the opportunity to create something new. And this is actually a point where I see is quite shared. This is a shared area of interest and practice for both anthropologists, regardless of whether they're academic or applied, or alternatively also entrepreneurs and management practitioners, is that we're interested in the new, I think. So, that conversation around what is new, how do we know it, how do we create the new, right, is a way that I've tried to share with my students. And then the other approach that I've enjoyed a lot has been co-teaching with colleagues from different disciplines. So a class that I created was called Out of the Box, Practical Approaches to Entrepreneurship and Innovation. And that was co-taught with a colleague who was from strategy, pure strategy and management scholar. A colleague with a background in physics and psychology, and me. And basically the gist of it was, how do we define what's a problem, right? And those three very, because of course in entrepreneurship, the problem solution dyad, right? That's very, that's on every pitch deck ever, right? This is the problem, this is the solution, ta-da, give us the money. Great. How do you define what's a problem, right? How do you know that it's a problem? Way before you start validating, right? And so that was a course where the three different disciplines offered kind of their own, not always reconcilable way of, this is how we look at this thing called the problem in social sciences. And I've also enjoyed that a lot, because I think it's kind of, hopefully it has planted in the heads of the students that not everything has to be reconcilable also, right? That's not how the world works. There's this, you can't always make the messiness really neat. And that's, I think that, by the feedback, people have enjoyed that kind of insight very much. But I would say that it pays for anthropologists to co-teach with colleagues from very different backgrounds, because it helps us also in structuring those courses and those formats. Well, again, whether it's a course or workshops or whatever, it really helps us also to probe and to innovate our own methods and our own vocabularies. And how do we translate, right? That's the biggest preoccupation. How do we translate anthropology, not only to students, but also to colleagues across campus or across industry?
And so based on your coaching experience, your entrepreneurship research, even the work you're doing now as part of the startup you're co-founding, what's your process for going about defining the problem space? What's my
long, good question, a very rich question, but long answers. The short answer to that will be that I believe a lot in the power of iteration. I think anthropology is very iterative, but we don't quite acknowledge it.
That's a good point.
Often ourselves, especially in the classic, in the classic settings and the academic settings. But I think through iteration and through keeping alert, I think anthropologists are very good. They're masters of serendipity and alertness, right? How do we know that we've reached a true insight? I mean, that's a very, very difficult question to kind of answer in 2 sentences, but it's kind of, and it's, also for me, it's an ongoing practice on how do I become better at translation, at, innovating, at scaling the mindset and whatnot. But I would say that I iterate a lot.
So you're involved also in, we've mentioned at the outset, but a number of, organizations that you're sort of volunteering at, I would say, right? And so, with iteration in mind, at EASA, you're trying to do some new clubs and kind of go global and sort of iterate on that existing model. So would you, just for anybody who's listening that maybe isn't familiar with the European Association of Social Anthropologists, would you just give a brief explanation of what that is? And then maybe we can talk about what you're doing to iterate on that model and where you're taking it globally.
Sure. Happy to. So the European Association of Social Anthropologists is the European counterpart of the AAA in the US. And through that, one of the interest groups is the Applied Anthropology Network, where I'm a co-convener currently with Markus Rottmüller and Pavel Borechki. And that group of that network is specifically dedicated to establishing a platform for promoting the value of applied anthropology broadly construed, right? Not only in business, but also in NGOs and non-for-profit sectors as well, government sector, activists, right? So it's a fairly broad network, fairly polyphonous, multiple voices in there about what it means to be an applied practicing anthropologist, which I love about the network. And so that's kind of the main platform and network in Europe for promoting the value of anthropology. Until now, why the world needs anthropology has been a kind of main event, and it will continue to be so. That's the annual conference. There's also a book that I know Dan spoke about that just came out. So that's the conference. But to that, going further, we're currently developing what's called Apply Clubs. And so Apply Clubs is a kind of a communitarian infrastructure, if you will. They are clubs. Each club has a leader or a group of leaders based on sub-specific topics. So I can tease already a little bit. We have Applied Club Innovation and Entrepreneurship coming up. We have Applied Club Legal coming up, Applied Club Design. And already we've kicked off Applied Club Anthropology in Organizations, Digital Methods in Remote Research, and Anthropology of the Built Environment. So those are fantastic colleagues that are leading those clubs. Some are based in Europe, some are based in the US. So it really is a kind of meeting place in a space of colleagues interested in a specific subtopics, finding mentors, finding jobs, discussing the latest in the topics and challenges that particular subfield shares. So this is kind of the things that we're building at the network going forward. But it is very much, although we are based in Europe, we're very much open to a broad range of conversations. And we collaborate a lot also with colleagues from around the world. So,
And so where can people find information on the clubs?
So that is going to be officially, very, very officially rolled out at the conference.
Got it.
So I wanna invite everybody to Why the World Needs Anthropology, an anthropologist conference in Prague. It's going to be in Prague, physical, but also online. This year the topic is on social movements, and a very exciting topic because I think we are, as I said, we are celebrating also the work of colleagues who are not necessarily in business, but it's a topic that I would argue actually is very important to business. I don't know if you want to talk about that or not, but the Applied Clubs are going to be officially announced also at the conference, and there's going to be a series of events where you get to talk to me and Markus about the overall structure and vision behind Applied Clubs. But also, whoever's interested in a specific club, they can just talk to the club leaders and meet the members at that event virtually.
Great. And
whoever's in Prague.
So there's still, for the event, there's still some calls for submissions of, I think, various sort of formats. Can you speak to any of those that are going on at the moment?
So I think by the time you publish the podcast, that call will be closed.
Okay.
But unless the program chair decides to extend it, and I'll admit that this is not yet the conversation that we've had, so I cannot say one way or another. But let me put it this way: whether people are able to submit to perspectives or an idea for a workshop, whether virtual or in Prague, is one thing, as being a participant. But I very highly also encourage everybody to attend as an audience and to get engaged into that conversation, even if they cannot, submit for whatever reasons, if the call does not get extended. Because I think the conversation another conversation we should be having a lot more is precisely between the business anthropologist and the activist practice in social movements that happens, right? I think businesses are increasingly going to have to take into account social activism, generational issues, the kind of the social scalability of tech, if you will, right? That is very much enmeshed with, and I would say, responding to, right? It depends on this kind of social mood out there. And we've seen this also, a lot of businesses get canceled because they're not sustainable. People stop buying their products, and this, on the other side, is driven by a need to understand the social movement. So I think it's very important, even though it doesn't say explicitly business or anything remotely encoded as business in this year's theme. I think the theme is tremendously important.
Yeah, I agree.
Also to business anthropologists, and vice versa. I think it's important for activists to find a way, if they want to inform and not just critique, right, business, which we also have. Sometimes very activist anthropologists are very critical of business and the effects of business and capital on communities, on practices, etc. So I think I see the biggest value, and that's why I'm so excited about this event, is that we can have those conversations. So the call for workshops and papers and submissions is, as of today, the 24th of July, still open, and that's on a link that I can send to you. And then it closes fairly soon. So, but perhaps, I don't know, if we decide to extend it, then perhaps you can include the link as you publish the podcast.
Yeah, we'll probably have this one out after that. But nonetheless, it's good to hear about, the perspectives that you're sort of trying to bring in. And I think that points to, the conversation, like you said, is important for business to be thinking about, the social issues, not just because, of course, we know that they sort of are being forced to change, right? But, right, they also obviously ought to change. Now, for the greater good. Now, some people, as you said, sit back and critique that and don't take it past that. Some people do join companies and make some degree of impact, but frequently probably not as much as they wish. Now, that's fine. That's still contributing. And, we would probably still encourage everybody to join businesses and make the small changes they can. But there is also another path, which is starting your own business, so that you have full control to do the right thing. And so you're charting down that path. And of course, it now relates to research you've done in the past on entrepreneurship, but now you're also sort of doing it for yourself. And so I guess I'd ask, what made you, take that leap? Why did you decide now was the time to do that? Maybe let's start there.
Why now? I really think that, the kind of epochal change and, existential conditions that climate change is going to bring upon us collectively on a planetary level and scale. Personally, I have been increasingly reflecting on, and why now? Because I think now is perhaps, and this is again very personal decision. It's not to say not even late, but it's it's time. It's time for people to start thinking about how do we address that individually, as communities, as professionals, right? And so I think, again, for me, it was a question of how does an anthropologist do something about it, right? About this complex upheaval that's coming. Part of it has been trying to be so vocal about anthropology and about infusing thinking like anthropologists wherever I can, right? Whether it's startups or whether it's talking to CEOs or venture capitalists. Uphill battle, right? I mean, I'm not gonna say unfortunately I cannot say that I've been as successful as I've hoped to be, but I think that now is the time for anthropology to really step up, whether as consultants or whether as entrepreneurs, and really creating ventures that are very much informed by anthropological thinking about the world and within the world, right? So this has been one of the aspects. And then why robotics? Why not quantum computing or, synthetic biology or whatnot? I really do think that robotics and hardware is actually a remarkably promising area of development. It's just, that's again, perhaps for another conversation or offline. But robotics to me is a underappreciated and also a very difficult area of innovation. Hardware is a very difficult area of innovation because it's very difficult to scale. And so I actually like difficult things.
I read Irresistibly Drawn to Complex Problems, Ambitious Projects, and Crazy People that you have in your bios. Great. It's definitely a great statement, and maybe good to end it there. Very inspiring. So, Lora, thanks for everything.
Thank you for inviting me.
My pleasure.
For giving me a stage to contribute my 2 cents.
Yeah, well, it's very welcome, and good luck with the startup. I support you in your endeavor to go out there and bring anthropology to the world. So thanks very much for coming on.
Thank you. Thank you, Matt.
Thank you for listening to the Anthropology in Business podcast. To learn everything you need to break into business anthropology and why business anthropology is one of the best lenses for contributing to business success, visit my website at mattartz.me, where I cover many topics related to business anthropology and beyond. There you will find all the podcast episodes, blogs, and news. Please like, share, and subscribe. See you next time.